The Nexarian Combat Academy floated in the void like a crystalline monument to galactic ego, its bioluminescent spires twisting skyward in defiance of physics and good taste. For 3 centuries, this institution had churned out the galaxy's finest warriors, each one more insufferably confident than the last. The Academy's motto, carved in 17 different alien scripts across the main entrance, proclaimed, "Where excellence meets perfection," which was really just a fancy way of saying we're better than you and we know it. The student body represented the cream of galactic combat culture. Tall, graceful Zephyrians glided through corridors on legs that bent in 3 places, their crystalline bones refracting light with each movement. Hulking Gorvani practiced their devastating ground pounds in reinforced training rooms, their 4 arms moving in perfect synchronization that had taken millennia to perfect. The insectoid hive minds of Praxis 9 moved as one fluid organism, their collective consciousness making them nearly unbeatable in group combat scenarios. And then there was the human. She had arrived 6 weeks ago with nothing but a small duffel bag and a credit chip loaded with enough galactic currency to pay for a full semester up front. No fanfare, no introductory combat demonstration, no boastful declarations about Earth's warrior tradition. She simply walked up to the admissions desk, slid her payment across the counter, and nodded when asked if she understood the Academy's no-refund policy. The Nexarian administrator had looked at her application with the kind of expression typically reserved for finding something unpleasant stuck to one's shoe. "Humid?" he'd asked, his voice dripping with the sort of disdain that suggested he'd rather process enrollment papers for a particularly dim asteroid slug. The girl had nodded. "From Earth." The same Earth that still uses projectile weapons and hasn't figured out faster-than-light communication. A third nod, this one accompanied by what might have been the ghost of a smile. The administrator had sighed the sort of sigh that conveyed 3 centuries of galactic superiority and stamped her papers with unnecessary force. "Dormitory assignment is on the back. Try not to die in your first week. The paperwork is annoying." That had been the extent of her verbal interaction with Academy staff. She'd found her cramped quarters in the lower levels, the ones reserved for scholarship cases and species of questionable combat potential, and settled in with the enthusiasm of someone attending their own execution. The other students had noticed her, of course. Hard not to notice the only bipedal mammal in a sea of sophisticated alien physiology. She stood roughly average height by human standards, which made her comically small by galactic one. Her hair was an unremarkable brown, tied back in a practical knot that suggested function over style. Her clothes were simple, durable, and entirely devoid of the decorative combat scarring that marked serious fighters among the more civilized species. "Look at it," a Zephyrian had whispered to his podmate during the first week, his voice carrying the musical quality of wind through crystal chimes. "It doesn't even have proper bone density modifications. How does it expect to survive a single sparring session?" "Maybe it's here to study our techniques," suggested a Gorvani, all 4 of his massive shoulders shrugging in unison. "You know how these primitive species like to copy superior culture." The hive minds of Praxis 9 had buzzed among themselves in ultrasonic frequencies, their collective judgment translated through their speaking drones. Observation: human appears structurally inadequate. Prediction: departure within standard rotation cycle. Amusement: high probability. But the girl hadn't left. She'd done something far more peculiar. She'd watched. Every morning at precisely 0700 Galactic Standard Time, she'd slip into the main combat amphitheater and take a seat in the upper observation deck. Not the VIP viewing pods where important visitors analyzed fighting techniques for diplomatic purposes, not even the middle sections where advanced students critiqued each other's form. She sat in the very back row, in seats so cheap and uncomfortable they were usually reserved for punishment details, and from there, she watched everything. Master Vorthak's legendary morning demonstrations became her daily ritual. Vorthak himself was a creature of myth made manifest, a Draknari warrior, whose species had evolved from predators so perfect they'd actually grown bored with hunting and turned to philosophy instead. His scales shifted color based on his emotional state, currently a deep amber that indicated focused instruction. 8 feet of refined violence, wrapped in the patience of someone who'd never met a technique he couldn't master or an opponent he couldn't read like yesterday's news feed. "Combat," Vorthak would intone in his resonant bass voice, "is not about strength. Any fool with sufficient muscle mass can break things. Combat is about understanding. You must know your opponent better than they know themselves. The girl would lean forward slightly during these speeches, her attention absolute. Vorthak's morning routines were legendary throughout the academy. He'd demonstrate techniques from 100 different fighting traditions, his movements flowing seamlessly from the ritual combat dances of the celestial courts to the brutal efficiency of deep space mining conflict. Students would gasp as he executed a perfect quantum strike, a move that required precise manipulation of localized space-time to land a blow that technically happened before it was thrown. Show off, the girl might have muttered if she'd been the sort to mutter. Instead, she simply observed, her eyes tracking every movement with the intensity of someone downloading software directly into her brain. The other students had their theories about the silent human. The popular consensus was that she was some sort of anthropological observer, sent by Earth's primitive government to study real combat techniques. The more charitable assumed she was simply too intimidated to participate and would eventually work up the courage to leave. None of them considered that she might actually be learning. After the morning demonstrations, she'd follow various classes throughout the day. Advanced gravitational combat, with Professor Nethys, where students learned to fight in rapidly shifting gravity fields. Psionic defense strategies with the floating brain entity known only as the consciousness, where mental shields were as important as physical ones. Zero-G adaptation training, where combat techniques were adjusted for environments where up and down were merely suggestions. She never took note, never asked questions, never participated in the post-class discussions where students would debate the finer points of technique and theory. She just By the end of her third week, she'd become such a fixture in the observation areas that the cleaning staff had started working around her. The automated systems had even learned to adjust the lighting in her preferred sections, recognizing her as a permanent fixture rather than a temporary visitor. "It's almost admirable," a Zetharian had commented to his study group. The dedication to complete irrelevance. If the girl had heard this particular observation, and given her habit of sitting within earshot of every conversation in the academy, she almost certainly had. She'd given no indication. She'd simply continued her routine with the methodical precision of someone following a schedule that made perfect sense to exactly one person in the known galaxy. And Master Vorthak, he'd noticed her too, though he'd kept his observations to himself. 3 centuries of teaching had given him an eye for students, and there was something about the human girl that didn't fit the usual patterns. Most observers grew bored after a few days. Combat theory was fascinating, but without practical application, it became as dry as Martian. But this one kept coming back, day after day, week after week, with the persistence of a stellar phenomenon that couldn't be explained by conventional physics. If Vorthak had been a betting creature, he might have placed odds on what the girl was really doing in his academy. But Draknari didn't gamble. They observed, they calculated, and they waited for the universe to reveal its intentions. He had a feeling he wouldn't be waiting much longer. The morning announcements that would change everything were still 3 weeks away, but even then Master Vorthak's scales had begun shifting toward a shade of intrigued purple that his students had never seen before. Part 2: The Watchers and the Watched. By the 5th week of the human girl's residency, her presence had become as predictable as the academy's artificial sunrise. She'd claimed the same seat in the observation deck, 3rd row from the back, slightly left of center, with the territorial instincts of a creature marking its domain. The custodial drones had actually programmed her location into their cleaning schedules, rotating around her position like planets orbiting an unusually stubborn star. Her methodology was becoming apparent to anyone paying attention, which ironically was virtually no one except the subject of her observation. Each day brought a new focus to her watch. Monday mornings were reserved for Master Vorthak's weapon demonstrations, where he'd cycle through an arsenal that would make a small military jealous. Tuesday sessions covered hand-to-hand fundamentals, Wednesday brought environmental combat scenarios, and so forth. The girl absorbed it all with the intensity of someone downloading the entire galactic internet directly into her cerebral cortex. Day 31, a Golvani student announced to his study pod, and the Earth creature still hasn't moved from spectator status. Current betting pool has reached 4,000 credits on her departure date. "What are the odds on her actually attempting combat training?" asked his podmate, 2 of his 4 hands gesturing dismissively. 17,000 to 1 again. The Zetharians calculated those odds using their mathematical consciousness, Apparently the probability of spontaneous stellar collapse is higher. They weren't wrong about the mathematical improbability. Humans weren't built for galactic combat where other species had evolved natural weapons, enhanced bone density, or bioelectric capabilities. Humans had developed something far less impressive, the ability to sweat efficiently and throw objects with reasonable accuracy. In a galaxy where casual sparring matches involved gravity manipulation and quantum displacement techniques, these seemed like bringing a pointed stick to a planetary bombardment. But the girl continued watching, and her watching had developed patterns that suggested something more complex than simple academic curiosity. During Master Vorthak's demonstrations of Draknari lightning techniques, combat moves that utilized rapid electromagnetilation to create stunning attacks, she'd lean forward and tilt her head at a specific angle. When he demonstrated defensive postures, her shoulders would subtly shift, mirroring positions that would be impossible to achieve without understanding the underlying physics. Fascinating behavioral adaptation, buzzed the Hive Mind Collective during their communal analysis session. Subject displays unconscious mimicry of observed combat positions, suggests primitive neural pathways attempting to process superior techniques, like a pet trying to understand quantum mechanics, added their speaker drone with what passed for amusement in their collective consciousness. The girl had also begun appearing in locations throughout the academy that weren't technically off limits but weren't exactly encouraged either. The auxiliary training rooms, normally empty during off hours, had started showing signs of recent use. Nothing dramatic, just slightly displaced floor mats, water dispensers that had been activated, environmental controls adjusted for human-compatible atmosphere. The security monitors had captured her presence during these sessions, but what they'd recorded was disappointingly mundane. She'd stand in the center of the room for extended periods, occasionally shifting through movements that looked like warm-up exercises or basic calisthenics. No weapons training, no combat drills, no attempts to replicate the advanced techniques she'd been observed. Pathetic, concluded a cluster of Zephyrian students who'd reviewed the footage during their recreational period. She's not even trying to train properly, just standing around looking confused. What they couldn't see from the security angles was the precision of her movements during these sessions. Each gesture was deliberate, economical, tested. She'd practiced the same sequence dozens of times, making minute adjustments that would be invisible to casual observation. A shift of weight distribution here, a modification of arm positioning there, subtle changes that suggested she was solving complex equations in her head. Master Vorthak had begun making his own observations, though he kept them characteristically to himself. 3 weeks into the girl's routine, he'd started incorporating slight variations into his demonstrations, a technique performed at a different angle, a defensive sequence executed with alternative timing, subtle modifications that would test whether his audience was truly paying attention. The girl's responses were immediate and consistent. Her posture would adjust to account for the new angles, her focus would intensify during modified sequences, and those mysterious after-hours training sessions would show corresponding changes in her own movement pattern.
"Interesting student you have there, Master," commented Professor Nethys, after a particularly complex gravitational combat demonstration. Her species communicated primarily through electromagnetic field manipulation, making her observations unusually perceptive. She processes information differently than typical academy pupils. Vorthak's scales had shifted to a thoughtful shade of deep blue. Indeed, most students attempt to replicate techniques immediately, often failing because they lack fundamental understanding. This one, he paused, considering. This one appears to be constructing something entirely different. The betting pools among students had evolved beyond simple departure prediction. New categories had emerged: probability of the human attempting actual combat training, likelihood of injury during first sparring session, odds of completing even basic certification requirements. The Zephyrians had created an entire mathematical model predicting her behavior patterns, complete with probability matrices and temporal projections. What none of them had calculated was the possibility that she wasn't trying to become like them. By week 6, the girl's presence had become such an accepted part of academy routine that students had stopped commenting on her existence. She was furniture now, a permanent fixture in the observation areas, as much a part of the scenery as the bioluminescent wall panels or the floating announcement displays, which made it all the more surprising when the morning announcements finally arrived. crackling through the Academy's communication systems, with the sort of official pomposity reserved for truly important proclamations. Attention students and faculty. The annual Grand Challenge tournament will commence in 14 days. Registration opens tomorrow at 0800 Galactic Standard Time. As per Academy tradition, any enrolled student may participate regardless of species, experience level, or probability of survival. The last part was delivered with the sort of bureaucratic indifference that suggested the Academy's legal department had required its inclusion. In her usual seat, the girl had straightened almost imperceptibly. For the first time in 6 weeks, something resembling expression had crossed her features. It looked suspiciously like a smile.
The Grand Challenge tournament was the Academy's crown jewel of pretentiousness, a yearly spectacle that drew observers from across the galaxy who came to witness the finest display of combat excellence in known space, which was really just marketing speak for watch privileged aliens beat each other senseless while feeling superior about their advanced techniques. The registration process had become a ritual unto itself. Students would queue in order of perceived combat prowess, with the most accomplished fighters claiming early slots to demonstrate their confidence. The Zephyrians formed elegant crystalline formations in their waiting lines, their natural geometry creating patterns that were probably aesthetically pleasing to someone. The Gorvani simply stood in intimidating clusters, their 4 arms crossed in synchronized displays of barely contained violence. The hive minds buzzed in harmonious frequencies that translated roughly to "we are inevitable." By noon on registration day, 43 students had entered their names into the tournament roster. Each entry had been accompanied by the appropriate fanfare, formal combat declarations, species-specific war chants, or in the case of one particularly dramatic Celestial Court representative, a 10-minute interpretive dance that somehow managed to convey both artistic expression and barely veiled threats of violence. The girl had appeared at the registration desk at 11:47 Galactic Standard Time. During the traditional lunch break, when most students were engaged in competitive eating or whatever passed for social interaction among their respective species, Nay asked the registration drone, its mechanical voice programmed with exactly the right amount of bureaucratic disinterest. The girl had written something on a data pad and slid it across the counter. The drone's optical sensors flickered as it processed the information. Species, human. Combat experience, none listed. Special equipment requirements, none. Emergency contact. The drone paused, emitting a soft whirring sound that might have been confusion. Listed as not applicable. Standard waiver acknowledgement. The drone continued, producing a document that was roughly the size of a small novel. This form indicates that you understand the Academy accepts no responsibility for dismemberment, disintegration, temporal displacement, consciousness fragmentation, or existence failure during tournament participation. The girl had signed without reading. Registration complete. Your preliminary match assignment will be posted this evening. Please note that withdrawal after registration incurs a penalty fee equivalent to 17% of your enrollment cost. She'd nodded once and walked away, leaving behind a registration desk that had processed thousands of combat applications but had never encountered someone quite so economical with both words and facial expressions. The news had spread through the Academy with the velocity of gossip in a closed system. The human girl, the same one who'd spent 6 weeks as a professional observer, had actually entered the Grand Challenge tournament. The betting pools had immediately erupted into chaos as odds makers scrambled to calculate probabilities for scenarios they'd never considered mathematically possible. "This changes everything," announced a Zephyrian pod leader to his assembled collective. "We need new mathematical model. The existing frameworks didn't account for suicidal behavior." "Maybe she's finally cracked," suggested a Gorvani, his massive frame rippling with what might have been sympathetic concern. Prolonged exposure to superior combat techniques without participation can cause psychological fragmentation in primitive species. The hive minds had been less charitable in their collective assessment. Hypothesis: human has developed delusions of adequacy. Prediction: spectacular failure resulting in educational value for Academy archives. Master Vorthak had received the news with characteristic stoicism, though his scales had shifted to a shade of deep purple that suggested intense concentration. He'd spent the afternoon reviewing the tournament bracket assignments, making subtle adjustments that would ensure the most educational outcomes for all participants. The preliminary matches began 3 days later in the Academy's Grand Amphitheater,
a massive arena that could accommodate spectators from 17 different atmospheric requirements simultaneously. The opening ceremonies had been appropriately grandiose, featuring speeches about honor, tradition, and the pursuit of combat excellence that managed to consume nearly an hour without conveying any actual information. The girls' first match had been scheduled for the afternoon session, paired against a mid-level Zephyrian student, whose crystalline bone structure made him virtually unbreakable by conventional standards. The matchup had been considered so one-sided that most spectators were treating it as a brief intermission before more competitive bouts. "Ladies, gentlemen, and collective consciousnesses," announced the tournament herald, his voice amplified throughout the arena. "Our next preliminary match features Academy student designation ZX7742 against the human student who apparently doesn't have a proper combat designation." The crowd's attention was politely disinterested. A few scattered beings in the upper sections were placing last-minute bets, probably wagering on how quickly the match would end rather than who would win. The Zephyrian student entered the arena with the fluid grace of his species, his movements creating small light refractions that painted rainbow patterns across the combat floor. He'd performed the traditional pre-combat ritual, a series of precise gestures that honored his ancestors and requested their blessing in the upcoming violence. The girl had simply walked to her designated starting position and waited. "Contestants ready," called the referee, a floating entity whose species existed primarily as organized energy fields. "Combat parameters, standard academy rules, victory by submission or incapacitation, begin on signal." The arena's combat initiation chime rang out with crystalline clarity. The Zephyrian had moved first, as expected. His species were known for opening gambits that combined speed with precision, typically overwhelming opponents before they could establish defensive position. His initial strike was a classic prism technique, designed to create multiple visual echoes of his true position, while delivering attacks from unexpected angles. It was a move that would have confused and defeated 90% of Academy students. The girl had sidestepped it with casual efficiency, her movement so minimal it barely qualified as evasive action. More importantly, her counterstrike had targeted the exact moment when the Zephyrian's light refraction technique left him momentarily solid and vulnerable. The impact wasn't dramatic, no spectacular energy discharge, no gravity-defying acrobatics, no combat techniques that required advanced degrees in physics to understand, just a precisely applied force at exactly the right moment in exactly the right location. The Zephyrian had crumpled to the arena floor with a sound like wind chimes falling downstairs. The silence that followed was the sort typically reserved for moments when the fundamental laws of physics had been observed doing something they probably shouldn't have been capable of. "Winner," announced the referee after a pause that lasted approximately 17 seconds longer than protocol suggested. "The human student." The betting pools had crashed so hard they'd taken the Academy's financial networks offline for 6 minutes. In the VIP observation area, Master Vorthak's scales had shifted to a color that didn't appear in any known Drachneri emotional spectrum. And in the arena, the girl had simply walked back to her starting position and waited for her next opponent. The tournament had suddenly become very interesting indeed. The girl's progression through the tournament bracket had been less like a series of combat matches and more like a systematic deconstruction of galactic combat theory. Each subsequent opponent had brought increasingly sophisticated techniques, advanced training, and growing desperation, as word spread through the Academy that something unprecedented was happening in Arena 3. Her second match against a Galvani heavy combat specialist had lasted exactly 43 seconds. The four-armed giant had attempted his species' signature move, the planetary crush, a devastating attack that utilized all four limbs in a synchronized strike capable of pulverizing reinforced battle armor. The girl had somehow positioned herself in the precise geometric location where the attack's force vectors cancelled each other out, leaving her opponent off balance and vulnerable to a counterstrike that exploded the brief moment when his massive frame was committed to a technique that had suddenly become useless. The third match had featured a hive mind collective, 3 beings who fought as a single consciousness, with perfect coordination. Their strategy involved simultaneous attacks from multiple angles, while maintaining constant communication through ultrasonic frequency. The girl had simply disrupted their communication by generating an interference pattern, apparently by humming at exactly the right pitch, turning their greatest strength into a liability as they struggled to coordinate without their shared consciousness. By the semi-final round, the arena was packed beyond capacity. Beings who had never shown interest in Academy tournaments were suddenly finding excuses to observe this impossible human, who seemed to treat advanced combat techniques like particularly challenging puzzles that needed solving. "She's not fighting them," Master Vorthak had observed to Professor Nethys during the intermission. "She's debugging them." Debugging? The electromagnetic entity's field patterns indicated confusion. "She's treating each combat style like a system with exploitable flaws. Instead of trying to overpower or out-technique her opponents, she's simply finding the errors in their programming." His scales had settled into a deep amber that indicated profound contemplation. In 3 centuries of teaching combat theory, he'd never encountered a student who approached fighting as an intellectual exercise rather than a physical contest. The semi-final had paired her against the tournament favorite, a celestial court warrior, whose species had elevated combat to an art form that combined deadly efficiency with aesthetic beauty. His techniques involved manipulating localized space-time to create attacks that technically occurred in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It was the sort of fighting style that required advanced mathematics just to understand, let alone count. The match had lasted 3.5 minutes, ending when the girl had somehow caused the warrior's dimensional attacks to interfere with each other, creating a feedback loop that had left him temporarily displaced 6 inches to the left of his own physical location. The medical staff was still trying to figure out how to fix that particular condition, which brought her to the final match. The arena had been reconfigured for the championship bout, expanding to accommodate the massive crowd that had gathered to witness what everyone assumed would be the human's inevitable defeat. Master Vorthak himself would serve as her final opponent, not because the tournament structure demanded it, but because no other instructor was qualified to properly demonstrate why humans didn't belong in galactic combat competition. "Ladies, gentlemen, and collective consciousnesses," the tournament herald announced, his voice carrying across the packed amphitheater, "the Grand Challenge Championship match will now commence." Representing 3 centuries of combat excellence and undefeated tournament legacy, Master Vorthak of the Draknari warrior. The master entered the arena with the fluid confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through superior technique and philosophical understanding. His scales reflected the arena lighting in patterns that seemed to suggest both lethal capability and infinite patience. And his opponent, the herald, paused, apparently still struggling with the same designation issue that had plagued the entire tournament. The human student who has somehow reached the championship match despite every mathematical model indicating this was impossible. The girl walked to her position with the same economical movements she'd displayed throughout the competition. No ritual preparation, no combat displays, no indication that she was facing the most accomplished fighter in the Academy's history. "An interesting journey you've taken to reach this point," Master Vorthak said, his resonant voice carrying easily across the arena. It was the first time anyone had heard him address her directly. "Tell me, what do you hope to accomplish here?" She looked at him for a long moment, then spoke for the first time since her enrollment 6 weeks earlier. "I came here to learn," she said, her voice carrying the sort of quiet confidence typically reserved for people who had spent considerable time being underestimated. "Mission accomplished." Vorthak's scales shifted to a shade of surprised respect. "And what exactly did you learn?" "That you've been teaching the same techniques for 3 centuries, that every style you demonstrate follows predictable patterns, that your entire approach to combat is based on the assumption that opponents will try to match your sophistication rather than exploit your predictability." The arena had gone completely silent. In the VIP sections, Academy administrators were beginning to look like they'd swallowed something particularly unpleasant. "Contestants ready," called the referee, though his energy field was flickering with what might have been nervous anticipation. "Begin on signal." The combat initiation chime rang out for the final time. Master Vorthak opened with the legendary Draknari sequence of infinite possibilities, a flowing combination of attacks that could transition seamlessly between 17 different techniques depending on the opponent's responses. It was considered the ultimate test of combat adaptability, a technique that had never been successfully countered in recorded history. The girl had stepped through the attack pattern like she was navigating a familiar room in the dark. Her movement wasn't faster than Vorthak's, wasn't more powerful, wasn't more technically sophisticated. It was simply correct. Every step placed her in the exact position where the master's next technique would be useless. Every gesture redirected his attacks into empty space or turned his own momentum against him. For the first time in 3 centuries, Master Vorthak found himself fighting an opponent who had apparently memorized every technique he'd ever demonstrated, and had spent weeks calculating the optimal counter for each one. The realization hit him just as the girl's final move, a simple hip throw that utilized his own weight and forward momentum, sent him crashing to the arena floor with undeniable finality. "Winner," announced the referee after a silence that seemed to last for geological ages, "the human student." In the aftermath, as medical drones attended to Master Vorthak's bruised dignity and the betting pools tried to calculate payouts that had broken several economic models, the girl had quietly collected her tournament trophy and headed for the exit. "Wait," Vorthak called out, his pride intact despite his horizontal position. "You never told us your name." She paused at the arena entrance, looking back over the assembled crowd of aliens who had spent 6 weeks assuming she was irrelevant. "I didn't think you'd asked," she said, and walked out. Later, reviewing the security footage of her training sessions with the benefit of hindsight, the academy staff would realize that she hadn't been practicing combat techniques at all. She'd been practicing solutions, specific counters to specific moves, calculated responses to predictable patterns, systematic approaches to problems that the galactic combat community had been too sophisticated to recognize as problems. The Nexarian Combat Academy still floats in the void like a crystalline monument to galactic ego. Its bioluminescent spires still twist skyward in defiance of physics and good taste. The motto carved across the main entrance still proclaims where excellence meets perfection. But these days they've added a small addendum underneath, barely visible unless you know where to look. Enrollment now open to all species, previous experience not required. Results may vary. Master Vorthak's scales had finally settled on a color that hadn't appeared in the Draknari emotional spectrum for over 2 millennia. Humble purple with flecks of genuine admiration. It turned out the Academy's greatest lesson hadn't been taught by any of its distinguished faculty. It had been delivered by a silent human girl who had spent 6 weeks learning not how to fight like everyone else, but how to fight like herself. And in a galaxy full of sophisticated combat techniques and advanced martial philosophies, that had made all the difference.